The raven landed on Sigrid's shoulder as if sent by the gods themselves. Its black eyes locked onto hers for a moment that seemed endless. The villagers stepped back, murmuring prayers and pleas. No one dared approach the widow who now bore Odin's mark. The black bird opened its wings and let out a cry that echoed through the frozen fjord, sealing the fate of the woman everyone had abandoned. Thank you for watching this story unfold. This channel is just beginning its journey, and every subscription truly means the world, helping keep this project alive as we aim for our first 1,000 followers. If you enjoy this tale, please consider subscribing and sharing your city in the comments below. Your support encourages us to bring more stories like this to life. The morning air bit sharply at Sigrid's exposed skin, its chill creeping through the holes in her worn woolen cloak and settling deep into her bones. The wind, relentless and cruel, weaved through the skeletal branches of the ancient pines, carrying with it the faint scent of snow and wet earth. The fjord lay still beneath a thick veil of mist, its dark waters reflecting the pale gray of the sky like a mirror cracked and fractured. A silence hung heavy over the village, broken only by the distant cry of gulls circling overhead and the faint, rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoing from the far edge of the settlement. In the heart of the village, nestled among rough-hewn timber cabins and stacks of firewood, Sigrid Thorvaldsdottir stirred slowly, her breath steaming in the frigid air. She rose from the straw-filled mattress that barely cushioned her weary body and moved to the small hearth, where embers glowed faintly beneath a thin layer of ash. Her fingers, stiff and trembling, coaxed the dying fire back to life. Thick smoke curled upward, carrying the sharp scent of pine resin and burning twigs. It filled the cramped space with a comforting, if faint, warmth that fought back the oppressive cold creeping through the cracks in the walls. Sigrid's face, framed by dark red hair tangled and dusted with frost, was pale but determined. Her green-gray eyes, sharp and watchful, scanned the room briefly before settling on the weathered leather pouch hanging by the doorframe, a collection of dried herbs, roots, and small vials containing tinctures she had prepared in the days before winter tightened its grip. Each item was precious, a fragment of life and healing amidst the harshness that threatened to swallow everything whole. She was 28 winters old, yet the lines etched across her face told stories deeper than mere years. A fine scar ran along her chin, a mark from a long-forgotten scrap with a wild animal during her youth. Her hands, rough and calloused, bore the evidence of years spent gathering and grinding herbs, stitching leather, and tending to the wounds of those few who sought her aid. There was little comfort to be found in her world now. Since the death of her husband, Leif, her existence had become a series of quiet struggles, a daily battle against cold, hunger, and the weight of silence that pressed down on her like the ever-falling snow. The village, once a place where she had known community and belonging, had retreated from her, drawing invisible lines that marked her as little more than a shadow on the periphery. Outside, the wind howled like a restless spirit, rattling the shutters and stirring the loose snow into swirling eddies that danced across the frozen ground. Dawn had barely broken, the sky a muted canvas of steel and ash, yet already the cold settled thick and impenetrable. Sigrid pulled her wolfskin cloak tighter around her slender frame, the coarse fur rough against her cheek, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, biting at her cheeks and the tip of her nose, turning them pink with cold. Her boots crunched over the frost-hardened earth, the sound a steady rhythm that mingled with the distant creaking of timber and the low murmur of villagers rising from their slumber. The scent of wood smoke hung in pockets along the narrow paths, mingling with the crisp, clean aroma of pine and frozen earth. She paused momentarily, inhaling deeply, feeling the cold air fill her lungs and sharpen her senses. Sigrid's home sat at the edge of the village, where the thick forest began its slow climb up the jagged cliffs that bordered the fjord. Beyond lay an expanse of wilderness, dark, untamed, and merciless. Here, the trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow, their trunks wrapped in thick moss and lichen. The forest floor, blanketed in white, was broken only by the occasional twisted root or the dark patch of frozen earth where the snow had yet to settle. She moved carefully, her breath visible in the frozen air, her eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Winter was an unforgiving time in these lands, and her survival depended on knowledge passed down through generations, the wisdom of plants, the signs of the changing seasons, the rhythms of nature. Yet this season felt particularly cruel, the cold deeper, the nights longer. The forest, once a source of life and healing, now seemed a vast, silent tomb. Her hands brushed against the rough bark of a birch as she ventured deeper, searching for the roots and herbs that still clung to life beneath the snow. The sharp scent of pine needles and damp wood filled her nose, mingling with the faint, sweet perfume of wild heather struggling beneath the frost. Every step was deliberate, careful. The snow hidden beneath layers of ice threatened to betray her presence with a sudden crack or slip. The forest was not just cold, it was watchful. Sigrid's mind wandered as she worked, memories surfacing like shadows in the half-light. She thought of Leif, his strong hands and easy smile, the warmth of his presence by the fire on long winter nights. How different things had been then. The village alive with stories and laughter, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat and fresh bread. Now, those days felt like a distant dream, obscured by grief and the sharp edge of loneliness. Her fingers closed around a small tangle of roots, the pale flesh brittle and resistant. She worked quickly, knowing that time was against her. The cold would soon bury these fragile gifts beneath a thick blanket of snow, making them unreachable until spring. Every root, every leaf was a precious commodity, a thread connecting her to life and hope. In the quiet stillness, a faint sound caught her attention, a soft, strained groan barely audible over the wind's relentless song. She froze, heart quickening, eyes narrowing as she scanned the shadows beyond the trees. Another sound, a fragile breath caught in the cold air. Following the faint noise, Sigrid moved cautiously, weaving between trunks and over frozen roots. There, half hidden beneath a brittle tangle of frozen branches, lay a man. His clothes were strange, fine fabrics unfamiliar in these parts, adorned with delicate stitching and brighter colors that seemed almost out of place in the muted wilderness. His skin was pale, lips tinged with blue from the cold. He shivered violently, his breath ragged, eyes barely open. For a moment, Sigrid hesitated. The man was a stranger, a foreigner, and from the symbols clutched around his neck, she knew he was of the Christian faith, the enemy that had brought death and destruction to their shores time and again. Yet something in his gaze, the mix of pain and fear, stirred a memory, a promise whispered long ago. "Keep your heart open," Leif had said, his voice steady but gentle, like the wings of a raven in flight, strong and free. Her hands moved swiftly but with care, brushing snow from his face and loosening the frozen bindings of his cloak. She lifted him with effort, feeling the weight of his broken body against her own, and carried him back toward the village. The forest seemed to hold its breath as she passed, the wind momentarily stilled, the shadows deepening. Back in her cabin, the fire crackled uncertainly, casting flickering shadows against the rough timber walls. She laid him gently on the straw mattress, her heart pounding as she worked to warm his stiff limbs. Her fingers trembled as she tore strips of cloth to clean the cuts on his forehead and legs, the blood dark against her pale skin. The scent of pine resin and burning wood mingled with the sharp tang of herbs as she brewed a bitter infusion, sage, juniper, and the last of the valerian root she had kept for emergencies. The steam rose in delicate spirals, filling the cabin with a faint sweetness that contrasted with the harsh cold outside. When Astrid, the blacksmith's wife, arrived with a rare offering of bread, her sharp eyes caught the subtle signs of company. The faint outline of 2 cups on the table, the hurried concealment of a wrapped bundle. Her smile was tight, her gaze probing. "Receiving visitors, Sigrid?" she teased, though the malice beneath her tone was clear. Sigrid's heart quickened, but she held her calm. "Only tending to my herbs," she replied quietly, hoping to deflect the growing doubts. Yet she knew the fragile peace they had built would not last. As the sun sank low behind the jagged peaks, shadows lengthened across the village, and the cold deepened. Sigrid felt the weight of watchful eyes, the tightening noose of suspicion and fear. She wrapped the small bundle, food, a warm fur, readying Gunnar for the night that would come with its own dangers. The forest waited beyond the trees, silent and endless. And somewhere within it, the harsh winds carried the first whispers of a fate yet to be decided. The forest remained silent, the snow muffling each careful step Sigrid took as she lifted the fragile bundle of roots and herbs into her leather pouch. Her breath came in shallow bursts, visible clouds in the cold air, fingers stiff despite the warmth of her woolen gloves. The sky above was a dull gray, heavy with the promise of another storm, and the wind howled around the ancient trees like a restless spirit seeking to drive her back to the cold safety of her cabin. But then came the sound, a faint, ragged breath, barely more than a whisper beneath the moan of the wind. Sigrid's sharp eyes darted toward the shadows between the trunks. There, tangled in the frozen undergrowth, lay a figure so fragile it seemed almost a trick of the light. A boy, no more than 10 winters old, shivering violently, his thin cloak torn and dusted with frost. For a moment, she froze, heart pounding like a drum in a distant hall. The boy's eyes were half closed, lips blue and cracked. His small hands clawed weakly at the snow, as though trying to grasp the fleeting warmth slipping away from his body. Sigrid's mind raced. This child was alone, lost, and exposed to the merciless winter night. Yet, the village had long whispered of dangers beyond the forest, wolves, rival clans, and worse. To take him in meant risking wrath, suspicion, perhaps exile. She had barely found safety for herself and the stranger she hid in her cabin. The cold seeped deeper into her bones as she knelt beside him, brushing the brittle snow from his tangled hair. The boy's breath caught in a fragile gasp, eyes fluttering open just long enough to meet hers. His gaze was a flicker of fear and pleading, silent words begging for mercy and warmth. Sigrid's heart clenched, memories of her own childhood surfacing beneath the frost of grief. She thought of her brother, lost to the sea, of her mother, whose voice was a faded echo. How could she turn away now? Her fingers trembled as she lifted the boy into her arms, the thin bones a burden heavy with despair and hope. The wind bit at her face, but the warmth of life pressed close against her chest. Every step toward the village felt like crossing a chasm between survival and sacrifice. Would the clan see her as a savior or a threat? The thought chilled her more than the winter's breath. Back at the edge of the village, shadows shifted as wary eyes watched her approach. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men shifted their grips on weapons sharpened by suspicion. Sigrid's thin cloak, once a shield, now seemed a fragile veil over the storm gathering in their hearts. She carried the boy with careful reverence, whispering soothing words in a voice roughened by cold and worry. Inside her cabin, the fire sputtered but fought against the gloom. She laid the boy gently on the straw mattress, wrapping him in furs scavenged from old hunts, remnants of the life she once shared with Leaf. His small chest rose and fell, the shallow breaths a fragile rhythm in the quiet room. Sigrid's hands moved quickly, mixing herbs she knew could ease fever and pain. Juniper to warm, willow bark to ease aches, and a pinch of valerian to calm the restless spirit. Night deepened beyond the wooden walls, and the wind's mournful song pressed against the shutters. Sigrid sat beside the boy, her gaze heavy with worry and resolve. Every crackle from the hearth was a heartbeat in the silence, every flicker of flame a fragile hope. She remembered the promise whispered before the gods. Her heart must remain open, like wings stretched wide against the storm. Outside, the village stirred with whispers and unease. Astrid's sharp eyes caught every movement near Sigrid's cabin, the flicker of light, the muffled sounds of care. She exchanged quick words with Sven, whose youthful anger simmered like a flame ready to ignite. The clan's patience was fraying, their fear growing into suspicion. To harbor a child alone, vulnerable and unknown, was a challenge to their codes and fears. Inside, Sigrid's thoughts were a tangle of memories and fears. She imagined the boy's journey, the cold nights, the hunger, the loneliness. What had driven him here, to the edge of this frozen wilderness? She wondered if the gods had spared him only to test her courage and compassion. The weight of her choice pressed heavily against her, but she knew there was no turning back. When the boy's eyes finally fluttered open again, Sigrid offered him a slow smile. In that moment, fear gave way to fragile trust. His fingers brushed hers weakly, a silent thank you whispered through the chill. The firelight danced across his pale face, softening the harsh lines of survival etched into his small frame. Outside, the raven circled high above the village, a silent witness to the unfolding story. Its black wings cut through the twilight, an omen unseen by most but felt deep in the bones of those who dared to watch. The boy's fate had become entwined with Sigrid's, tied by threads of mercy and defiance that would soon ripple through the frozen lands like a storm. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with cold light, Sigrid prepared for the coming day, a day that promised judgment, suspicion, and perhaps salvation. She clasped the boy's small hand, drawing strength from the warmth that still lingered despite the relentless winter. The choice to help had been made. Now, she would face whatever came with the fierce heart of a woman who refused to turn away from the lost and abandoned. The cabin's worn wooden door creaked softly as Sigrid eased Gunnar inside, the weight of his frail body nearly sapping the last of her strength. The cold from outside clung to his clothes, a thin layer of frost glistening on the edges of his cloak. She closed the door quickly, shutting out the biting wind and settling into a fragile sanctuary carved from timber and flame. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of smoke, pine resin, and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Shadows played across the rough-hewn walls, cast by the flickering light of a small fire that struggled to push back the encroaching gloom. Sigrid moved with careful deliberation, lowering Gunnar gently onto the straw-stuffed mattress that smelled faintly of old fur and wood smoke. His blue eyes fluttered weakly, barely able to focus on the dim space around him. She sat beside him, brushing a lock of damp hair from his forehead, her fingers trembling as they traced the pale skin marred by a shallow cut. His breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps, each one a fragile victory against the relentless cold that gnawed at his lungs. The fire sputtered, sending warm tendrils of light curling into the corners, but the room remained cold, the chill seeping into the cracks between the floorboards. Sigrid reached for her leather pouch hanging by the door, fingers closing around a small bundle of dried herbs. She worked quickly, crushing leaves of juniper and sage between her rough palms, the sharp scent rising and mingling with the smoke. Slowly, she boiled water over the fire, the kettle's soft hiss filling the silence as she prepared a bitter, herbal infusion meant to fight fever and ease pain. Gunnar's lips moved silently, forming words she could not understand, the foreign tongue soft and unfamiliar in the quiet room. His gaze searched hers, troubled and uncertain, but beneath the fear was something else, a flicker of relief, perhaps, or a quiet gratitude. Sigrid nodded once, wordlessly offering the warm cup to his trembling hands. His fingers, Sigrid's breath caught. She had kept the pendant hidden, a secret remembrance of the man she had saved and the promise she clung to, a symbol of warmth and life preserved against the harsh winter. She tightened her grip on his hand, a silent reassurance that he was safe, at least for now. The hours passed slowly as the night deepened outside, the wind's mournful howl pressing against the cabin walls. Sigrid worked tirelessly, her hands steady despite exhaustion, tending to Gunnar's wounds with cloth and salve, brushing away the frost that clung to his skin. She wrapped him in furs scavenged from old hunts, layering warmth over his trembling frame. At one point, Gunnar stirred, his eyes fluttering open to meet hers once more. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but the single word he spoke cut through the darkness like a beacon. "Thank you." The simple phrase, foreign and unfamiliar, carried a weight that needed no translation. Sigrid nodded, her own throat tight with emotion. There was no time for grand declarations, no space for the comfort of familiar words. Instead, they shared a quiet understanding, woven through gestures and glances, the kind of trust born from shared hardship and the flickering hope of survival. Outside, the village remained steeped in suspicion and unease. The flicker of light from Sigrid's cabin was a beacon to some, a threat to others. The whispered rumors had already begun to spread, about the stranger, about the woman who dared to defy the clan's unspoken rules. But inside, the world had shrunk to the warmth of a fire and the fragile breath of a man saved from death. As the embers glowed low, Sigrid caught a glimpse of Gunnar's fingers curling around a small silver cross hidden beneath his tunic, a symbol of a faith as foreign to her people as the lands beyond the sea. Yet, there was no anger in her heart, only a quiet resolve to protect this fragile life, to honor the promise whispered long ago beneath the watchful eyes of the gods. In the stillness that followed, Sigrid found herself listening not just to his ragged breaths, but to the silent conversation unfolding between two worlds, a fragile bridge built on mercy, courage, and the unspoken hope that even in the coldest winters, life could find a way to endure. The sharp crack of twigs breaking beneath heavy boots echoed faintly through the frozen forest, a sound both mundane and ominous under the heavy cloak of winter's silence. Sigrid's fingers tightened around the edge of her wolfskin cloak as her eyes flicked toward the shadowed tree-line, heart pounding beneath layers of wool and fur. The scent of smoke from her hearth mingled with the cold air, drifting beyond her cabin walls, a beacon that no longer protected but betrayed. News traveled fast in the village, as swift and unforgiving as the northern winds. Whispers had already spread like wildfire from mouth to mouth, from the blacksmith's forge to the mead hall, and beyond the rugged stone circle where the elders met. There was talk of a stranger, an outsider clad in foreign cloth, carrying the mark of the Christ, someone whom no Viking should shelter. The fear in the villagers' eyes was palpable, a mixture of suspicion and anger. Sigrid's neighbors, once distant but civil, now turned away with cold glances. Mothers pulled children closer when she passed. Men tightened their grips on axes and spears, and even the dogs growled low, sensing the tension weaving through the air like a creeping frost. Astrid's sharp eyes had not missed the signs. The two wooden cups on Sigrid's table, the faint glow of a fire burning late into the night, the hurried concealment of a bundle wrapped in worn leather. The blacksmith's wife was quick to spread her suspicions, her words barbed and sharp, seeding distrust among the already wary clan. "She harbors the enemy," she hissed in the market square, voice low but venomous. "She invites ruin upon us all." Sven Halfdanson, the young warrior with eyes as cold as the winter sky, had taken up the charge with fervor. His youth burned with a fierce desire to prove himself, to defend the clan's honor. He prowled the edges of the village like a wolf scenting prey, his gaze fixed on Sigrid's cabin whenever he dared. When he found the larger boot prints in the snow near her hearth, too large to be hers alone, he took them as undeniable proof of her betrayal. That morning, the villagers gathered in uneasy clusters beneath the dark canopy of pines that bordered the settlement. The air was thick with frost and whispered accusations. From the smoky shadows emerged Håkon Magnusson, the clan's chieftain, his presence commanding attention despite the biting cold. His heavy cloak trailed behind him, embroidered with symbols of Thor's hammer and runes meant to shield him from harm. But his expression was grave, marked by lines carved deep from years of leadership and battle. He moved with measured steps to Sigrid's cabin, his eyes sharp and unyielding. Behind him followed a handful of warriors, their faces hardened, weapons sheathed but ready. The sun, weak and pale, struggled through the heavy clouds, casting long, eerie shadows over the snow-covered ground. Sigrid stood in the doorway, her posture unbroken despite the chill that seemed to seep into her bones. Her green-gray eyes met Håkon's with steady defiance, the weight of countless sleepless nights and whispered threats resting upon her shoulders. She knew what would come: accusations, judgment, perhaps exile. But she would not cower. Håkon's voice cut through the crisp morning air, cold and firm. "Sigrid Thorvald's daughter, you stand accused of harboring the enemy, a Christian stranger whose presence endangers our people and defies the gods." The words fell like stones, heavy and unyielding. Around them, murmurs swelled into a tide of outrage. "Treason," some shouted. "She betrays her husband's memory," others hissed. Sigrid's heart thundered, but her voice remained steady. The man was dying. He sought no harm, but shelter. Her eyes flicked briefly to the bundle she had hastily hidden beneath her cloak, the small amber pendant, warm against her skin. "I did what any would, what Leif would have wanted." A bitter laugh escaped Astrid as she stepped forward, her gaze sharp and accusing. "You risked all for a Christian, for a faith that would burn our sacred groves and cast our gods into shadow. How can you claim honor in that?" Håkon raised a hand, and the crowd fell silent, their breaths visible in the frigid air. His gaze swept over the gathered faces before resting once more on Sigrid. "The clan's laws are clear. Such acts bring death or exile. Yet, the gods have their will, and we must listen, even when it challenges us." Sigrid's breath caught. The memory of the raven, Odin's own messenger, came rushing back, its black eyes fixed upon her, its cry echoing through the frozen fjord. That moment had shifted something in the air, a silent command that even Håkon could not deny. Suddenly, a piercing cry shattered the tension. From the edge of the village, a group of hunters and traders returned, their faces weathered and drawn, bringing news that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. "A rival clan moves closer," one called out, breath ragged. "They scout our borders, seeking weakness." Håkon's eyes narrowed, and the weight of leadership settled heavily on his broad shoulders. The village had no room for division now, not with enemies circling like wolves. Yet, here was a woman, an outcast, standing firm with a secret that threatened to unravel everything. Later that day, as the sun dipped low and the village prepared for the long, dark night, Sigrid sat alone in her cabin. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped the small bundle closer to her chest. Gunnar was gone, fled into the forest under cover of darkness, but his memory lingered like a shadow in the cold corners of the room. Outside, the wind howled like the voices of the ancestors, carrying warnings and prayers across the frozen fjord. She could feel the eyes of the clan upon her still, their suspicion a palpable weight. Yet, beneath it all, a quiet resolve burned, a stubborn flame that would not be extinguished. For Sigrid knew that to protect the vulnerable was to defy not only the clan, but the very laws carved by sword and fire. It was a path fraught with danger, yet one she would walk with steady heart. The gods had shown their hand. The raven's message was clear. And so, as night fell and the village settled beneath a blanket of ice and shadow, the village square was thick with murmurs, voices low but charged with a dangerous undercurrent. Some spoke in hushed tones of betrayal, of dishonor and treason. Others, more quiet and hesitant, whispered prayers to Thor and Odin, seeking guidance in the darkening hour. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, their wide eyes reflecting flickering torchlight. The elders, wrapped in furs and heavy cloaks, exchanged glances that spoke of ancient wisdom and hard decisions. Then, like a shadow borne on the wind, Håkon Magnusson appeared. The chieftain's heavy boots crunched over frozen earth, each step measured, deliberate. His eyes, dark and sharp as the northern night, swept over the gathered crowd before settling on Sigrid. The scars on his face, fresh and old, told tales of battles waged beyond these peaceful woods. But tonight, his expression was colder than steel. He wore his mantle of leadership like armor, a red wool tunic embroidered with the hammer of Thor, a cloak lined with bear fur that draped over his broad shoulders. His hand rested near the haft of his ceremonial axe, a silent reminder of the power he wielded. Yet even he seemed burdened, as if the weight of the clan's fate lay upon his shoulders like an unyielding stone. Sigrid Thorvaldsdottir, Håkon's voice carried across the square, low and commanding. You stand accused before the council of harboring the enemy, an act of treason that could bring ruin upon us all. The crowd responded with a swell of voices, some angry, some fearful, others uncertain. Treason, death to the traitor, shouted a few, their faces twisted with rage. But others hesitated, caught between loyalty to the clan and the quiet stirrings of doubt. Sigrid met Håkon's gaze without flinching. Her green-gray eyes held the calm resolve that had carried her through the darkest days. He was dying, she said, voice steady despite the cold fire burning in her chest. No harm came from his presence. I acted with mercy, as any would who claims the god's favor. A bitter snarl broke from the crowd. Astrid, the blacksmith's wife, stepped forward, her eyes sharp and accusing. Mercy, she spat. You risked all we hold sacred for a Christian, a worshipper of false gods who would burn our groves and cast our ancestors into shadow. How can you claim honor in such folly? Sigrid's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, letting Håkon silence the rising fury with a raised hand. The chieftain's eyes flicked toward the darkening sky, where the first stars began to pierce the twilight. The gods do not always speak in thunder and flame, Håkon said gravely. Sometimes their will is hidden in shadows and silence. The raven that settled upon Sigrid's shoulder was no mere bird. It was Hugin, the thought of Odin, sent to mark her as protected. A hush fell over the crowd, the storm of anger dissipating into a fragile tension. Some faces softened, uncertainty replacing rage. Others exchanged glances filled with suspicion and unease. It was one thing to condemn a woman for harboring an enemy, another to defy a sign from the gods themselves. Sven Halfdanson, the young warrior whose voice had been the loudest in accusation, stepped forward, his blue eyes burning with a mixture of anger and fear. If the gods protect her, he said, voice sharp like the edge of a blade, then why did they not save our brothers lost in battle? Why send a Christian among us? Håkon's gaze turned icy, pinning Sven with the weight of years and authority. The gods' ways are not ours to question. Sometimes their lessons come wrapped in mystery and pain. But we must heed the signs, lest we bring destruction upon ourselves. The murmurs resumed, some voices grudgingly accepting the chieftain's words, others still bristling with doubt. The council elders gathered, their faces lined by time and hard experience, ready to judge not only Sigrid's actions, but the future of the clan itself. Suddenly, a sharp cry shattered the uneasy peace. From the far edge of the village, a scout arrived, breathless and coated in frost. His voice was urgent, carrying news that twisted the atmosphere like a sudden storm. "A rival clan approaches," he gasped, eyes wild with fear. "They scout our borders, seeking weakness, ready to strike." A collective shudder passed through the crowd. The shadows beyond the trees seemed to close in, the danger no longer distant or imagined. Hawkins' expression darkened, the weight of leadership settling deeper into his shoulders. "The time for judgment is now," he declared. "The enemy is at our gates. We cannot afford division, not when the lives of our people hang in the balance." Sigrid felt every eye turn toward her, suspicion and hope mingling like fire and ice. She knew what was expected, proof of her loyalty, of her courage. No longer could she simply stand accused. She would have to face the clan, the gods, and the threat bearing down on them all. That night, the longhouse was filled with the scent of pine smoke and burning torches. The great hall echoed with whispers and the shifting of heavy furs as the clan gathered in uneasy silence. Hawkins sat at the head of the table, the carved wooden wolf that symbolized their heritage resting before him like a silent sentinel. Sigrid stood beside the fire, the amber pendant heavy against her chest. Her hands, rough and calloused, clenched and unclenched as memories surged. Of Gunnar's pale eyes, the promise made to Leif, the raven's cry that had pierced the frozen air like a summons from the gods themselves. Hawkins' voice rose, commanding attention. "Sigrid, you will speak before the council. Tell us what drove you to defy the clan and harbor a stranger." She took a breath, steady despite the cold knot of fear twisting in her stomach. "He was not an enemy," she said, voice clear. "He was a man beaten by the sea and the winter's fury. I saw no gods in his faith, only a soul in need. To turn him away would have been to deny the mercy that our ancestors taught us." A murmur ran through the hall, some nodding, others frowning. "He carries the mark of the Christian," Astrid interrupted sharply. "How can you justify that?" Sigrid met her gaze squarely. "Faith is not a weapon to wield against kindness. The gods taught us to protect the weak, to honor life even when it challenges us. The raven that came to me was a sign that this act was not betrayal, but a test." Håkon leaned forward, eyes burning. "Then you choose to place your judgment above the laws of the clan?" "No," Sigrid replied. "I choose to honor the true spirit of those laws, the strength to show compassion in the face of fear." A flicker of respect seemed to pass between Håkon and the elders. Thyra Ulfsdottir, the ancient seer and voice of wisdom, rose slowly, her silver hair catching the firelight. Her pale eyes seemed to pierce through time itself as she spoke. "The gods often speak in riddles and signs not easily understood," she said, voice strong despite her age. "This raven was a message, not just for Sigrid, but for us all. To reject her is to reject their will and invite ruin." The room fell into a thoughtful silence. Outside, the wind howled against the wooden walls like a wild beast, a reminder of the harsh world beyond the village's fragile safety. Håkon finally nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "Then it is decided. Sigrid Thorvaldsdottir shall remain among us, her actions held under the protection of Odin's raven." A collective breath seemed to release from the crowd, tension easing though not extinguished. Some faces reflected relief, others held grudging acceptance. But the danger outside remained, a rival clan closing in, the threat of violence looming like the dark winter night. Håkon stood, his voice resolute. "Tonight, we prepare, not only for battle but for the future. This clan will not fracture under suspicion or fear. We stand together, guided by the gods' will." Sigrid felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The clan had accepted her, for now, but the path ahead was uncertain, shadowed by enemies both within and without. As the firelight flickered and the clan began to ready for the coming storm, Sigrid touched the pendant beneath her cloak. A silent vow passed through her lips, to protect this fragile piece, to honor the mercy that had saved a stranger and, in turn, saved her own soul. Outside, a lone raven circled high against the cold moonlight, its black wings cutting through the night. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, Gunnar. The stranger whose life Sigrid had saved now returned, his steps cautious but determined. His pale face was touched by the firelight, revealing eyes steady with resolve and gratitude. The murmurs in the hall grew quiet, disbelief rippling through the gathered crowd. Many had believed he was gone, a fleeting shadow lost to the merciless winter. Håkon Magnusson's gaze sharpened as he regarded the man who had stirred such turmoil. His hand rested lightly on the haft of his axe, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of understanding or perhaps grudging respect. Gunnar's presence was undeniable truth brought to the clan's doorstep. Sigrid's heart thudded in her chest, a mixture of fear and hope swirling like the embers at her feet. She stepped forward, meeting Gunnar's gaze with a quiet strength. The room seemed to hold its breath as the chieftain broke the silence. "Speak," Håkon commanded, his voice carrying the weight of leadership and the stubbornness of a man hardened by battle. "Tell us your tale, stranger. Why did you come among us, and what truth do you bear?" Gunnar's voice was steady, though tinged with weariness from the journey. "I am no enemy," he began, his words measured and deliberate. "My ship was lost to the storm, and the sea cast me into your land, weak and broken. Sigrid showed me mercy when none would. In her kindness, I found life." A hush settled over the hall, the flickering flames reflecting in the eyes of those who listened. Gunnar continued, his gaze sweeping across the faces etched with suspicion and curiosity. "I carry no weapon against you, nor do I bear ill will. I come with respect for your ways and the strength of your people, the gods who watch over you. They spoke in the form of the raven. I believe this was no mere chance." Håkon studied Gunnar carefully, weighing his words against the harsh realities of war and treachery that had scarred their lands. "And yet you bear the symbol of another god," he said, nodding toward the small silver cross that hung from Gunnar's neck. "How do we trust one who carries the mark of the Christians, who have spilled Viking blood without mercy?" Gunnar met the accusation without faltering. "Faith can be many things," he said softly, "but it does not bind the heart to hatred. I honor the courage of your people and the strength of your gods. My survival is a testament not to conflict, but to compassion, something I found in Sigrid." The room remained silent, the council weighing Gunnar's words against the years of enmity and loss. Then, from the far side, Thyra Ulfsdottir, the ancient seer, rose with the dignity of age and wisdom. Her voice, though frail, carried the weight of conviction. "The gods often test us with choices that challenge our deepest fears," she said. The raven that came to Sigrid was a sign, a message that mercy and courage are not weakness but strength. To turn away from this truth would be to forsake the very gods who guide us. Sigrid's eyes glistened with unshed tears, the burden of isolation lifting as the weight of acceptance began to fill the room. Even Astrid, whose sharp tongue had stoked suspicion, looked down, the firelight softening the harsh lines of her face. Håkon's voice finally broke the stillness, firm but tempered with a new understanding. Sigrid Thorvaldsdottir acted with the heart of a true Viking, not in betrayal, but in bravery. She honored the gods by protecting life where others saw only enemies. Gunnar's return confirms the truth she has spoken. A murmur of assent passed through the hall, a ripple of relief and cautious hope. Sven Halfdanson, the young warrior whose anger had once threatened to consume Sigrid, stepped forward. His eyes, still sharp but less cold, met hers. "You risked much to shelter him," Sven said quietly. "Perhaps I was too quick to judge. The gods may indeed move in shadows we do not always see." Sigrid nodded, her voice steady. "We all walk a path shaped by the gods' will. Sometimes it leads through hardship, but it is mercy that binds us as a people." The council dispersed slowly, The weight of judgment lifted, but the future still uncertain. Outside, the wind had calmed, the stars shining clear and cold over the silent fjord. Sigrid lingered by the fire, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the amber pendant that carried the warmth of connection beyond boundaries and bloodlines. Later, as the village settled into uneasy peace, a figure approached her quietly. Gunnar's steps were soft against the frozen earth, and when he spoke, his voice was low, filled with gratitude. "You saved me," he said simply. "Not just from death, but from loneliness. I owe you more than words can say." Sigrid met his gaze, the shared silence speaking volumes. "You taught me that mercy is not weakness," she replied, "and that even in the darkest winters, the light of compassion endures." Together, they stood beneath the vast northern sky, where the lone raven soared against the moon's pale glow. It was a silent witness to a story of redemption and courage, a reminder that even in a world carved by ice and steel, the heart's warmth could kindle hope and change destiny. In the days that followed, Sigrid's place within the clan was no longer that of a shadow at the edge, but a woman embraced by the people she called family once more. The wounds of suspicion and fear began to heal, replaced by a cautious but growing trust. The gift she carried, the amber pendant, remained a secret symbol of connections beyond the fjord's frozen reach, a talisman of the fragile peace born from courage and kindness. The rival clan's threat lingered on the horizon, a reminder that danger was never far. Yet, beneath the cold sky, the village prepared, not just for battle, but for a future shaped by acceptance and the unyielding strength of mercy. Sigrid's story became one whispered around the firelight, a tale of a widow who dared to listen to the god's voice carried by a raven's wings. It was a story of redemption and resilience, of a woman who reclaimed her place in a world where honor was not measured solely by bloodshed, but by the courage to save a life when all else seemed lost. And as the seasons turned, the raven's cry echoed still, a timeless reminder that even in the harshest lands, the gods watched over those who dared to open their hearts. The first light of dawn spilled softly over the fjord, brushing the icy waters with pale hues of pink and gold. The village stirred quietly beneath the gentle awakening, a subtle shift in its rhythm that spoke of change yet to take root fully. The heavy shadows of suspicion that had clung to Sigrid's home, like a thick frost refusing to melt, were already beginning to thaw. Though the winter's cold still bit into the land, there was a fragile warmth weaving itself through the hearts of those who called this place home. Sigrid stood at the edge of the village, the wind tugging at her dark red hair that tumbled loose from its usual bindings. Her wolfskin cloak, heavy and worn, was pulled tight against the early chill, but it could not guard against the quiet stir of hope rising within her. Her green-gray eyes traced the frozen fjord's distant horizon, where the first birds of spring had not yet returned, but where their promise lingered, just beyond the edge of sight. Since the council's decision, the village had shifted in ways subtle but undeniable. The heavy silence that once met her passage had softened into nods of acknowledgement, cautious smiles of acceptance. The fire in the longhouse now held room for her presence, her voice threading through stories shared over mugs of mead. The elders, once wary, sought her counsel as they faced the looming threat of rival clans. Even Astrid's sharp gaze had dulled, replaced by a grudging respect that whispered of grudges softened, if not yet forgotten. The amber pendant nestled beneath her tunic was a secret she carried with quiet reverence. It was a talisman not only of Gunnar's survival, but of the impossible bridge she had built between worlds. A symbol of mercy and courage, one that transcended the cold lines drawn by blood and faith. Gunnar himself was gone now, having slipped away under cover of darkness to find his own path beyond the village's snowy borders. Before he left, they had shared a moment beneath the ancient pines, their breath mingling in the crisp air like smoke from a dying fire. Words had been few, but the unspoken bond between them had grown strong. A fragile thread woven from Sigrid found solace in her work, tending the roots and herbs that had long been her lifeline. The knowledge passed down from her mother, and her mother's mother before her, was a quiet legacy she carried with pride. Each tincture, each poultice prepared beneath the flickering light of the hearth, was a prayer whispered to the gods, a plea for healing not just of bodies but of hearts and minds. Children began to approach her with less hesitation, their wide eyes curious rather than fearful. Mothers thanked her quietly for cures that soothed fevered brows, for wisdom that eased the ache of loss. In these small acts, the threads of community were rewoven, delicate but resilient as the new shoots breaking through winter's grasp. One evening, as the sky deepened into twilight, Sigrid sat by the fire in the great hall, the amber pendant warm against her skin. Around her, the clan shared stories of the gods and ancestors, tales of valor and sacrifice, but also of mercy and unexpected kindness. The flickering flames painted shadows across worn faces, smiles softening the lines etched by hardship. Thyra Ulfsdottir, the ancient seer, settled beside her, leaning heavily on her carved oak staff. Her eyes, pale and gleaming with unspoken wisdom, met Sigrid's with a quiet warmth. "The gods have chosen well," she said softly. "In mercy, there is strength. In courage, there is life." Sigrid nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within her. The path ahead would be hard. Winter was far from over, and the world beyond the village remained as wild and uncertain as ever. But for the first time since Leif's passing, she felt a flicker of peace, a fragile flame that promised endurance. Outside, the raven soared once more, its black wings cutting through the night sky like a silent sentinel. It was a reminder that the gods watched, that their will was woven through the lives of mortals in ways both seen and unseen. In the quiet that followed, as the embers glowed low and the villagers drifted toward their dreams, Sigrid rose and stepped outside. The cold bit at her skin, but she welcomed it, the sharp breath of the north a reminder of all she had survived and all yet to come. Looking up, she saw the stars scattered like shards of ice across the velvet sky, and somewhere beyond, the moon hung full and bright. The raven's cry echoed faintly, a song of endings and beginnings, of fate and free will entwined. Sigrid clasped the amber pendant once more, feeling its warmth pulse like a heartbeat. She whispered a silent vow to the gods, to Leif, to Gunnar, and to herself, that she would walk the path ahead with an open heart, fierce and unyielding. For in a world carved by steel and shadow, it was mercy that would forge the strongest legacy. The village had settled into a cautious quiet, as if holding its breath after the storm of judgment and the shifting tides of fate. The longhouse hummed with low conversations, voices tempered by the weight of recent days and the promise of battles yet to come. Outside, the winter wind whispered through the bare branches, carrying with it the scent of pine and the faint trace of distant snow. The cold was relentless, but within the walls of the village, a fragile warmth was beginning to take root. Sigrid stood by the fire, the amber pendant resting against her chest like a heartbeat of memory and hope. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the faces gathered in the great hall, faces marked by hardship, loss, but also by resilience. The stories told around the fire wove threads of the past with strands of the present, binding the clan together in ways words alone could never capture. Her eyes drifted to the worn wooden beams above, where carvings of wolves and ravens watched silently over the gathering. The raven, once a harbinger of suspicion and fear, had become a symbol of mercy and protection. It was a reminder that even in a world shaped by steel and bloodshed, the gods could arrive in the quiet moments between heartbeats. The weight of her journey pressed gently against her thoughts. The cold nights spent tending to Gunnar, the whispered prayers beneath the thick wool of her cloak, the silent defiance that had held her firm when the clan's voices rose like thunder. Each memory was a thread in the tapestry of her survival, woven not with the sharp edge of a sword, but with the softer, steadier hand of compassion. Outside, the village's rhythms began to return to a fragile normalcy. The blacksmith's hammer rang out again, steady and sure, shaping iron as it had for generations. Children's laughter, tentative and new, floated on the wind, a fragile bridge between the past's shadow and the future's uncertain dawn. Mothers tended to their fires and their fears, while the warriors sharpened their blades, eyes ever watchful of the horizon. Sigrid's place among them was no longer that of an outcast, but of a woman reclaimed by her people, not by might, but by an act of mercy that had tested the very foundations of their beliefs. The amber pendant, tucked safely beneath her tunic, was a secret she carried alone, a quiet testament to the fragile bond between worlds, a symbol of the courage it takes to open one's heart when all seems lost. The seasons would continue their relentless turn. Spring would eventually break the frozen grip of winter, coaxing new life from the earth. But the lessons of that harsh season, the lessons of trust, courage, and the unexpected grace found in mercy, would linger, etched deep into the bones of the land and the people who called it home. Sigrid often found herself drawn to the edge of the village as twilight fell, where the fjord stretched wide and still beneath the gathering stars. The sky was a vast canvas of cold fire, each star a silent witness to the stories etched into the snow and stone. Sometimes she would spot a lone raven soaring high against the dark velvet of night, its wings cutting through the air like shadows cast by the gods themselves. In those moments, she whispered silent thanks, not just to Odin, but to all the forces that had guided her through the night, to Gunnar who had shown her the unexpected strength of mercy, and to Leif whose memory lingered like a gentle flame within her. The world was vast and often unforgiving, but beneath the cold sky, the spark of compassion had found a place to burn bright. Her thoughts often wandered to the future, uncertain, fragile, but filled with possibility. The village faced threats from rival clans, the harshness of the land itself, and the shifting tides of old and new beliefs. Yet, there was a new thread woven into their fate now, one made not just of blood and iron, but of mercy and courage, a reminder that even in the darkest winters, the heart could still find its way. As the fire in the longhouse dimmed and the clan drifted to rest, Sigrid stepped outside into the biting night. The air was sharp, each breath a small flame in the cold. She lifted her face to the sky, the stars gleaming like shards of ice scattered across the heavens. The moon hung full and bright, casting pale light over the frozen fjord. A solitary raven called out, its cry sharp and clear, a song of endings and beginnings, of fate and free will entwined. Sigrid watched as the bird disappeared into the darkness, carrying with it the silent promise that the gods were watching, that their will was woven through the lives of mortals in ways both seen and unseen. She clasped the amber pendant one final time, feeling the warmth pulse beneath her fingers, a fragile flame that had endured the cold, a beacon of hope preserved against the harshness of the world. The story of mercy, courage, and redemption. The story of a woman who dared to answer the call of compassion in a land ruled by steel and shadow was far from over. And as the winds whispered through the trees and the stars watched silently from above, the legacy of that choice spread quietly through the village, carried on the wings of a raven, and etched into the hearts of all who would listen. In the end, it was not the sword that shaped destiny, but the strength to save a life when all else seemed lost. If this story touched the part of you that believes in the power of mercy and courage, join us on this journey. Subscribe, share, and stand with us as we unravel more tales carved by the gods and lived by those who dared to defy fate itself. For in the coldest winters and darkest nights, it is the warmth of the human heart.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.